A story of guilt, redemption, and the weight of buried truths. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Church like 1,000 desperate fingers seeking entrance. Father Thomas Moreau sat alone in the confessional booth, his weathered hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. For 43 years he had listened to the sins of his congregation: adultery, theft, lies, cruelty, and offered absolution with a steady voice and a believing heart. But tonight, at 71 years old, with his own mortality pressing against his chest like a physical weight, he waited for a confession he knew would shatter everything he thought he understood about forgiveness. The church door creaked open at precisely 9 o'clock, just as the anonymous note had promised. Father Thomas heard the slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty nave, each step a countdown to something inevitable. His heart hammered in his chest, and he found himself praying, not for the visitor, but for himself, for the strength to hear what was coming. The footsteps stopped. The confessional door on the other side opened with a whisper and then closed. In the darkness, separated only by the carved wooden screen, two people sat in silence, both knowing that what would be spoken in the next hour would change everything. Father Thomas had discovered the note that morning, tucked inside the collection basket during early Mass. The handwriting was precise, almost surgical in its neatness. Father Thomas, I will come to you tonight at 9 p.m. for confession. Come alone. Tell no one. What I carry has waited 30 years to be spoken, and it concerns you more than you could possibly imagine. The truth about what happened to your brother has been buried long enough. Someone who can no longer live with silence. The note had fallen from his trembling fingers and drifted to the floor like a dying leaf. His brother, Vincent. The wound that had never healed. The loss that had hollowed him out and driven him to the priesthood in the first place. Vincent had disappeared 30 years ago, vanished without a trace on an October evening, leaving behind a fiancée, a promising career as a prosecutor, and a family destroyed by not knowing. The police had investigated for months. They'd dragged the river, searched the woods, questioned everyone Vincent knew. The theories had multiplied like viruses. Maybe he'd been killed by someone he was prosecuting. Maybe he'd run away to escape some secret shame. Maybe he'd simply wanted to disappear. But there was never a body, never a ransom note, never a single confirmed sighting. Vincent had simply ceased to exist, as if the universe had reached down and plucked him from reality. Thomas had been 28 when it happened, a young priest filled with idealism and certainty. The disappearance had tested his faith like nothing else ever had. How could a loving God allow such cruelty? How could he let a family twist in the agony of not knowing? Thomas had screamed those questions into the void, had wept until he thought he might dissolve entirely. And eventually, because he had no other choice, he had accepted that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. He had built his life around that acceptance, constructed 43 years of faith and service on the foundation of unanswered prayers. And now, someone claimed to know the truth. Thomas had moved through the day in a fog, performing his duties with mechanical precision while his mind spun in circles. He thought about calling the police, but the note had been explicit. Come alone. He'd thought about confiding in Father Benedict, the younger priest who assisted him, but the words had stuck in his throat. This felt intensely personal, almost sacred in its weight. Whatever was coming, Thomas needed to face it himself. Now, sitting in the darkness of the confessional, Thomas forced his voice to remain steady. Welcome, my child. You said in your note that you have something to confess. I'm listening. The silence stretched for so long that Thomas began to wonder if the person had changed their mind. Then, finally, a voice emerged from the darkness. Male, middle-aged, rough with emotion. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 30 years since my last confession. 30 years of living with murder. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. The word hung in the air between them like poison gas. I killed your brother, Father Moreau. I killed Vincent, and I've spent 3 decades watching you suffer, knowing I was the reason why. And I can't carry it anymore. I'm dying, Father. Cancer. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4. And I realized that I'd rather spend my last days in prison than die with this secret eating me alive. Thomas's world tilted violently. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden seat beneath him, the only solid thing in a suddenly liquid reality. 30 years. This man had known for 30 years, had watched Thomas grieve, had perhaps even sat in this very church, had let the Moreau family twist in their agony while keeping this monstrous secret. "Who are you?" Thomas heard himself ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that you hear everything. You need to understand how it happened, why it happened. And then you need to decide what to do with me. Tell me." The words came out harder than Thomas intended, edged with decades of pain. "Tell me everything." The man's voice, when he began, was hollow with exhaustion and regret. 30 years ago, I was a different person. My name was David Brennan. I worked as a loan officer at First National Bank. I had a wife, 2 kids, a house in the suburbs. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But inside, I was drowning. I'd gotten involved with some people I shouldn't have, organized crime types who used the bank to launder money. I didn't mean for it to happen. It started small, just looking the other way on certain transactions, accepting gifts to expedite applications. But it escalated. It always escalates. Thomas listened, his entire body rigid with tension. He wanted to scream at this man, to demand he get to the point, to explain how any of this justified murdering an innocent person. But he'd spent 43 years learning to listen, and that training held him silent. Your brother Vincent was prosecuting a case against Marcus Devlin. You probably remember that name. Devlin was a mid-level organized crime figure, but he was connected to everyone who mattered. The trial was high profile. If Vincent won, it would open doors to investigate dozens of other people, including the people I was involved with, including, eventually, me. The rain outside intensified, creating a wall of sound that seemed to seal them away from the rest of the world. I was approached by a man named Sal Torino. He told me they needed Vincent to go away, permanently. He said if I helped them, they'd erase my debts, protect my family, set me up for life. If I refused, David's voice cracked. He showed me photographs of my children. Sarah was 7. Matthew was 9. He didn't have to say anything else. Thomas felt ice water flowing through his veins. "So you chose to murder an innocent man to save yourself and your family?" "Yes." The word was barely audible. "God help me, yes." They gave me the plan. Vincent had a habit of jogging along the river path every evening. Same route, same time. Predictable. I was supposed to intercept him, force him into a car they'd provide, drive him to a location they'd specified. After that, they said I wouldn't have to be involved in what came next. I could tell myself I was just the driver. But that's not what happened, Thomas said, his voice thick with barely contained fury. No. I intercepted Vincent like they planned. I had a gun, they'd given me that too. But when I approached him, when I saw his face, he recognized me, Father. We'd gone to the same gym. We'd chatted in the locker room dozens of times about sports, about our kids. He smiled at me when he saw me. He actually smiled, like we were just 2 acquaintances meeting by chance. David's breathing had become labored, punctuated by what might have been sobs. I pulled the gun, and his smile died. He understood immediately. He didn't beg or plead. He just looked at me with this profound sadness, like he was disappointed in me specifically, like I'd let him down personally. And then he said something that's haunted me every day since. He said, "You have children, don't you? What will you tell them about who their father is?" Thomas closed his eyes, imagining his brother in those final moments, facing his death with dignity and concern for his killer's soul. It was exactly the kind of thing Vincent would say, even at the end, thinking about someone else. "What did you do?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer would destroy him. "I shot him, right there on the path. It was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong, but I panicked. I couldn't bring myself to take his wallet, his watch, so I dragged his body into my car, drove him to the location they'd specified, an abandoned industrial site by the docks, and I left him there. I was supposed to call Torino to tell them it was done, that they could come dispose of the body properly. But I couldn't. I drove home, threw the gun into the river, and sat in my garage for 6 hours trying to figure out how to live with what I'd done. And Vincent's body, Thomas forced the words out. I went back the next morning, planning to call the police anonymously to at least give your family the chance to bury him. But the body was gone. Torino's people had found him anyway, had cleaned up my mess. I found out later they'd cremated him, scattered the ashes in the ocean. There was nothing left to find, nothing to bury. The confession booth felt smaller now, suffocating. Thomas's chest heaved as he tried to process decades of grief suddenly given a face, a name, a reason. His brother had been murdered by someone he'd smiled at, someone he'd been kind to, someone whose children he would have helped protect if he'd known they were threatened. I kept waiting for the police to come, David continued. Every day for months I expected to be arrested. But they never found any evidence. The investigation eventually went cold. Marcus Devlin was convicted based on the work Vincent had already done. Ironically, Torino and his associates were busted a year later in an unrelated investigation. They all went to prison, and I was left free. Free to live with what I'd done. Thomas sat in the darkness, his mind reeling through 30 years of pain in seconds. He thought about his mother, who had died 5 years after Vincent's disappearance, never knowing what had happened to her son. He thought about Vincent's fiancée, Jennifer, who had waited 2 years before finally accepting he was gone, who had eventually married someone else but had never quite lost that haunted look in her eyes. He thought about himself, the hundreds of nights he'd prayed for answers, for peace, for understanding. Why now? Thomas finally asked, his voice raw. Why confess after 30 years? Because you're dying? Because you want absolution before you face judgment? Partly, David admitted. I won't lie to you, Father. The thought of dying with this secret terrified me more than anything. But it's more than that. 5 years ago, my daughter Sarah, the 7-year-old girl I was supposedly protecting when I killed your brother, she was murdered by her husband in a domestic violence incident. She'd called me 2 days before it happened, told me she was afraid, asked me for help. And I didn't take it seriously enough. I told her to work it out, to try counseling. I failed her. Thomas heard the anguish in David's voice, the self-loathing that mirrored his own decades of pain. When Sarah died, I realized something. I'd killed an innocent man supposedly to protect my children. But I'd also taught them, through my actions even though they never knew, that you could justify any evil if you framed it as protecting family. I'd modeled cowardice and murder, and even though Sarah never knew what I'd done, I wonder if somehow the poison of my choices infected my family anyway. If I'd been brave enough to refuse Torino, to trust the police, to accept the consequences, maybe I would have been a better father. Maybe Sarah would have learned to demand better protection, to insist on safety. Maybe she'd still be alive. Thomas understood that David was trying to draw a line between his choices and his daughter's death, seeking a pattern in the chaos of tragedy. It was something Thomas had done himself countless times, trying to understand why God had allowed Vincent to be taken. You can't know that, Thomas said quietly. Your daughter's death was caused by the man who killed her, not by choices you made decades earlier. Maybe, but I'll never know for sure. And I realized I couldn't die without at least trying to give you what I stole from your family. The truth. You deserved to know what happened to Vincent. You deserved the chance to hate the person responsible. You deserved closure. Closure. Thomas repeated the word bitterly. You think telling me this provides closure? You think knowing my brother was murdered by someone he'd been kind to, someone he trusted enough to smile at, provides closure? No, David said simply. It doesn't, but it's the truth. And the truth, however painful, is better than the endless void of not knowing. Isn't it? Thomas wanted to say no. He wanted to scream that he preferred the mystery to this horrifying reality. But deep down, he knew David was right. For 30 years, Thomas had created 1,000 scenarios in his mind about what might have happened to Vincent. Some were better than the truth, many were worse. but none of them had allowed him to properly grieve. They'd all left him suspended in a state of eternal question, unable to fully mourn, unable to fully heal. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked. "Forgiveness." "I don't deserve forgiveness," David said. "What I want is for you to call the police. I'll give you a written confession, signed and witnessed. I'll tell them everything I told you. I'll spend my last months in prison, and I'll die there. It's not justice. Real justice would be giving you your brother back. But it's something. It's acknowledgement. It's consequence." Thomas sat very still, his mind working through the implications. For 43 years he had preached forgiveness. He had told countless people that mercy was divine, that holding on to hatred only poisoned the hater, that God's love extended even to the worst sinners. He had believed it with every fiber of his being. But now, faced with the man who had murdered his brother, who had stolen Vincent from the world and left a family to suffer in ignorance for 3 decades, Thomas found that all his carefully constructed theology was crumbling. He wanted to hate David Brennan. He wanted to refuse him absolution, to tell him he was damned, to watch him suffer the way Thomas had suffered. And yet he was a priest. He had taken vows. He had dedicated his life to being a channel for God's grace, not a judge of who deserved it. If he turned away from those vows now, what had the last 43 years meant? What had Vincent's death accomplished if it only created more hatred, more pain, more chains of suffering? Thomas took a deep breath, forcing his racing heart to slow. "Before I respond to your confession, I need to know one more thing. Your son, Matthew, where is he now?" The question seemed to surprise David. "Matthew? He's an attorney in Seattle. He specializes in criminal defense, actually, helping people accused of crimes. He's a good man, Father. Both my kids turned out good despite having me as a father. And your wife. Catherine died 3 years ago. Heart attack. She never knew what I'd done. I made sure of that." Thomas nodded slowly, even though David couldn't see him in the darkness. A picture was forming in his mind. A picture of concentric circles of pain radiating out from a single act of violence. Vincent's death had destroyed Thomas's family, yes, but it had also poisoned David's life, had potentially contributed to Sarah's death, had left Matthew unknowingly carrying the legacy of his father's crime. Violence never stayed contained. It spread like a virus, infecting everyone it touched. "David," Thomas said carefully, "you came here expecting me to call the police. You want to be punished. You want your confession to have concrete consequences. And I understand that impulse. You want to finally face what you've been running from. But I need you to consider something. If I call the police right now, if you're arrested and imprisoned, what does that actually accomplish?" "Justice," David said immediately. "Accountability. Your family finally knows what happened. My mother is dead," Thomas said flatly. "Vincent's fiancée has moved on with her life. My sister lives in Australia and has barely spoken about Vincent in 20 years. The only person who would truly benefit from your prosecution is me, and I'm not certain it would benefit me at all." "What are you saying?" Thomas leaned forward, his voice intense. "I'm saying that revenge and justice are not the same thing. I'm saying that you being in prison for the last 3 or 4 months of your life doesn't bring Vincent back. It doesn't undo 30 years of pain. It just creates more suffering. For you, for your son who would learn the truth about his father, for everyone involved. So you're saying I should just walk away, live my last months free after what I did?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "I'm saying something harder than prison. I'm saying you need to live with full consciousness of what you did, without the escape of punishment. I'm saying you need to use whatever time you have left to do something meaningful with this truth." David was silent for a long moment. "I don't understand." Thomas closed his eyes, praying for the right words. "When you killed Vincent, you took away everything he would have been. All the cases he would have prosecuted. All the good he would have done. All the love he would have shared. You can't bring him back, but you can try to put back into the world some of what you took out. You have money? Some. The people I worked for did pay me well, even though I never touched most of it. It's been sitting in accounts, earning interest, blood money, then use it. Vincent was passionate about helping vulnerable people, women in domestic violence situations, children caught in the system, the wrongly accused. Create a foundation in his name. Fund it with everything you have. Make sure his name does some good in the world. And more than that, volunteer. Use your last months working with the people Vincent would have helped. Be his hands in the world since his hands were stolen. That's not justice, David protested. That's letting me off easy. Easy? Thomas almost laughed. You think living every day with full consciousness of what you did, looking into the faces of the people Vincent would have helped, knowing you're only doing this because you murdered him, you think that's easy? You think carrying his name forward, honoring his memory while knowing you're the reason his memory is all that's left, that's easier than sitting in a prison cell waiting to die? Thomas could hear David breathing hard on the other side of the screen, could hear him struggling with this idea. Prison would be a relief, Thomas continued. Prison would let you stop pretending. Prison would give you clear boundaries, a defined punishment, an end point. What I'm suggesting is that you live in the unbounded space of genuine remorse, that you face every day the people you harmed, that you see Vincent in every person you help and know you can never do enough. Why would you want that for me? David asked, and his voice was broken. Why wouldn't you want me to suffer? Because I've spent 43 years learning that making people suffer doesn't heal anything, Thomas said. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't undo harm. It just creates more pain in the world, more brokenness, more damage. And I think, his voice caught, I think Vincent would agree with me. He spent his life trying to repair harm, not multiply it. If I use his death as an excuse to multiply harm, even to the person who killed him, then I'm betraying everything he believed in. The silence that followed felt sacred, weighted with something larger than both of them. I need to ask you something, David finally said, and I need you to be honest. Do you forgive me? Thomas let the question hang in the air. It was the central question, the one everything else revolved around. Did he forgive David Brennan? Could he? No, Thomas said quietly. I don't, not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did was unforgivable by any human measure. You murdered my brother. You stole him from everyone who loved him. You let us suffer in ignorance for 30 years. I'm not capable of forgiving that. Not in this moment. He heard David's sharp intake of breath, the sound of hope dying. But, Thomas continued, I'm also not capable of hating you the way I want to, because I've spent my entire adult life believing that every person, no matter what they've done, carries a spark of the divine, that every person is more than their worst action. And if I abandon that belief now, then my entire life has been a lie. So what I can offer you is this. I release you from the confession booth. I release you to do the work I've described. I release you to honor Vincent's memory with whatever time you have left. And if you do that, if you genuinely devote your remaining life to repairing some fraction of the harm you caused, then perhaps, someday, maybe after I'm dead too and we're all standing before whatever judgment awaits us, perhaps then I'll be able to forgive you. You're not going to call the police? No, because I genuinely believe that what I'm asking of you is harder than prison. And because I believe in rehabilitation more than revenge. And because I think Vincent would have wanted his death to lead to more light in the world, not more darkness. Thomas heard movement on the other side of the screen. The sound of David standing. I don't deserve this, David said. No, Thomas agreed. You don't, but grace isn't about deserving. It's about being given a chance to become someone better than who you've been. Don't waste it. The confessional door opened and closed. Thomas heard David's footsteps receding toward the church entrance, then the heavy door opening and closing one final time. He was alone again in the darkness, alone with the truth he'd spent 30 years seeking. Thomas sat there for a long time, letting the tears finally come. He wept for Vincent, for the life stolen and the decades lost. He wept for his mother, who had died without answers. He wept for David Brennan and the coward he'd been, the price his cowardice had extracted from everyone around him. He wept for himself, for the young priest who had struggled with his faith in the face of meaningless loss, For the old priest who now had to grapple with the meaning of forgiveness when it was hardest. When the tears finally subsided, Thomas stood on shaky legs and made his way out of the confessional. The church was empty and dark, lit only by the votive candles flickering near the altar. He walked to the front pew and sat, looking up at the crucifix that dominated the space. "I don't know if I did the right thing," he said aloud to the empty church, to God, to Vincent's memory. "Maybe I should have called the police. Maybe justice demanded it. Maybe I'm just a coward hiding behind theology." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. What he'd asked of David Brennan was not cowardice. It was perhaps the hardest thing imaginable. To live fully aware of your worst actions, to spend your remaining time trying to repair the irreparable, to carry the name of the person you murdered as a sacred trust, that required more courage than simply accepting punishment. Thomas thought about all the sermons he'd given over the years about mercy and redemption. He'd always meant them, had always believed them on an intellectual level, but he'd never truly tested them against the deepest well of his own pain. Now he had, and he'd discovered that his faith was both more fragile and more resilient than he'd imagined. It bent under the weight of this revelation, but it didn't break. Over the following weeks, Thomas watched and waited. He didn't know if David would actually follow through or if the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate delusion. But then, 3 weeks after the confession, Thomas received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the establishment of the Vincent Moreau Foundation for Justice and Family Safety, funded by an anonymous donor with an initial endowment of $2 million. The foundation would provide legal services to domestic violence victims and support programs for at-risk youth. There was also a handwritten note. "Father Thomas, I've begun the work. I volunteer 3 days a week at the women's shelter downtown, doing whatever they need. Cleaning, administrative work, talking to residents when they need a listening ear. I've told them I'm trying to make amends for past failures. They don't know the specifics, but they accept my help. Every day is hard. Every day I see the ripples of violence and cowardice, and I know I contributed to that ocean of pain. Every day I want to give up, to just let the cancer take me. But then I think about what you said, that this is harder than prison, and that's why I need to do it. I'm also writing everything down. The full truth about what happened to Vincent, about the people involved, about all of it. When I die, my lawyer has instructions to send it to you. Then you can decide whether to share it with the police, with your family, or keep it private. The choice will be yours. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm trying. For Vincent. For Sarah. For my son who deserves better than to have a murderer as a father, even if he never knows it. For myself, and whatever small chance I have at redemption. Thank you for showing me a harder path than the easy escape of punishment." David Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to a photograph of Vincent taken a week before he disappeared. In the photo, Vincent was laughing, his head thrown back, his face full of life and joy and hope for the future. "I hope this is what you would have wanted," Thomas whispered to the photograph. "I hope I honored your memory. I hope I didn't just let him off easy." But deep down, Thomas knew he hadn't. He'd given David Brennan something far more demanding than punishment. He'd given him responsibility. The responsibility to carry Vincent's name forward. The responsibility to repair harm. The responsibility to live fully conscious of his worst self while striving to become better. David Brennan died 4 months later, just as the doctors had predicted. In his final weeks, he'd managed to establish partnerships between the Vincent Moreau Foundation and several legal aid organizations. He'd completed a training program to become a volunteer crisis counselor. He'd convinced 2 other major donors to contribute to the foundation. He'd written letters to dozens of domestic violence survivors, sharing what little wisdom he'd gained from his own failures. Thomas attended David's funeral, sitting in the back row, unrecognized by the small gathering of mourners. David's son, Matthew, gave a eulogy describing his father's last months, the mysterious change that had come over him, his sudden passionate commitment to helping others. "I don't know what happened to my father in those final months," Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. He wouldn't talk about it. "But he became someone I barely recognized, someone driven by a purpose I didn't fully understand. He told me once, near the end, that he'd spent his life as a coward and was trying to die as a brave man. I think he succeeded." After the funeral, Thomas approached Matthew and introduced himself, saying only that he'd counseled David in his final months and wanted to express his condolences. "Did he find peace?" Matthew asked, searching Thomas's face for answers. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I think he found purpose," he said finally, "which is perhaps more important than peace. Peace is a gift. Purpose is something we create through our choices. Even when those choices are hard," Matthew nodded slowly, not entirely understanding, but accepting the wisdom anyway. Thomas walked away from the cemetery feeling something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Not closure exactly, but perhaps a different kind of opening. The mystery of Vincent's disappearance had been solved, but a new mystery had taken its place. The mystery of redemption, of whether a person could transform themselves even at the end of their life, of whether forgiveness was something given or something earned through transformation. He didn't have answers to these new mysteries, but he had something better. He had a living memorial to his brother in the foundation that now carried Vincent's name forward. He had proof that even the worst actions didn't have to be the end of the story, that there was always a possibility for new chapters. That evening, Thomas knelt in the empty church and prayed, not for answers, not for peace, but for the strength to live with complexity, with the uncomfortable truth that justice and mercy were sometimes in tension, that forgiveness could be both given and withheld, that the hardest path was often the one that refused simple binaries of punishment and absolution. "Vincent," he whispered into the candlelit darkness, "I hope I did right by you. I hope the foundation helps people. I hope your name brings comfort and justice to those who need it. And I hope that wherever you are, you understand why I did what I did." The candles flickered in a draft from somewhere, and Thomas chose to interpret it as acknowledgement, as Vincent's way of saying he understood, that he approved, that he was at peace even if Thomas wasn't quite there yet. Thomas stood, his knees creaking with age, and walked toward the rectory. Tomorrow he would continue his work, counseling the troubled, comforting the grieving, listening to confessions, offering what grace he could in an often graceless world. He would carry the weight of David's confession, the truth about Vincent's death, the complexity of his own choice to offer a harder path than punishment. It was a heavy burden, but Thomas had spent 43 years building the strength to carry heavy burdens, and he knew now, with a certainty born from the darkest test of his faith, that carrying such burdens was perhaps the most sacred work a person could do. The rain had stopped. The night was clear, stars visible through breaks in the clouds. Thomas paused at the door of the rectory and looked up at those stars, at the vast, unknowable universe that held both tragedy and redemption, both violence and healing, both judgment and mercy. "Thank you," he said simply, to God, to Vincent, to the strange grace that had brought David Brennan to his confessional booth and given Thomas the chance to test his faith against the hardest question of his life. Then he went inside, to whatever tomorrow would bring, carrying the truth like a lamp in the darkness, a light that illuminated without providing easy answers, that demanded more questions, more thought, more careful attention to the complexity of human hearts and the possibility of transformation even in the shadow of death. The confession was over. The work of living with its implications had only just begun.